Hey there! I am really excited to share my thoughts on this camera because it definitely punches way above its weight, and this camera is only coming in at $800 brand new. Now, this camera can shoot 6.2K open gate in F-Log2 10-bit 422 and can even do external RAW recording. So very impressive camera for $800, and I can't wait to go through this camera with all of you. So before I get into the video though, I just want to mention that B&H Photo lent me the camera and the lens to test out and review and make videos like this for all of you. If you are interested in picking up some camera gear, go check out B&H. There are links in the description for the XM5 and this lens and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So huge thanks for B&H for making this possible. Also, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Josh, and on this channel I do technical deep dive reviews and tutorials, and I focus almost exclusively on video. So if you're interested in the photo side of this camera, this is not going to be the video for you. Now, this video will be basically broken up into two parts. The first part will be image quality and general stuff about the camera, and then the technical deep dive stuff will be later on for those nerds that are looking for more technical information. There are chapter markers linked down below, so you can skip around as usual. So first of all, let's talk about image quality, because that ultimately is the most important part of any camera. And anytime I get a new camera, the first thing I like to do is go out and shoot with it. So I took it out to capture some street video. So all of that was shot in the 6.2K open gate mode in F-Log2 on the Fuji XM5 using the Fuji 18mm f1.4 and the Typoc Samara C 35mm lens. If you're curious about the Typoc Samara Cs, there's some really cool lenses, and I made a recent review about those. I'll leave that video link down below. Now, this is a very sharp camera, and I recommend turning the sharpness all the way down, and I also have the noise reduction turned down all the way and turned off, which is how I'd recommend using this camera, because this camera is incredibly detailed and sharp, and I don't want to add any more sharpness to it or anything artificial. So F-Log2 is really easy to work with, in my opinion, and there are free technical LUTs that are supplied by Fuji that work really well. If you're interested in those, I'll leave a link down in the description. There are also color space transforms in DaVinci Resolve for F-Log2. Now, when F-Log2 was introduced with the Fuji X-H2S, there weren't color space transforms yet available in DaVinci Resolve, but Fuji did a great job with providing those technical LUTs. Now, there aren't yet color space transforms at the time of recording this for Fuji's new log profile, the F-Log2C, but F-Log2C is not on this camera, and F-Log2 works beautifully in DaVinci Resolve. Now, F-Log2 has a base ISO of 1250, so you'll need a little bit more ND filtration than you normally would if you have a camera that has a base ISO of like 640 or 800, or you have to stop down the lenses a little bit more. Now, if you're not interested in shooting an F-Log2 and color grading, there are, of course, all of the usual film simulations that you get in Fuji cameras, and you can get a whole bunch of looks right out of camera. So you do have those all available if you are looking to use the built-in film simulations. Next, we'll talk about the body design, ergonomics, and I/O of this camera. So it comes in two different flavors. This one is the silver and black version, which I think looks pretty cool. They also do make an all black version. So let me give you a quick tour around the camera here and show you some of the different things going on. And I think we'll start with the top of the camera. Now, on the left side of the camera here, we have the film simulation dial. So you can easily change between the different film simulations and some different custom presets and stuff like that if you are shooting film simulations in photo or video. You have the hot shoe here, which it doesn't even come with a little cover for that. There's very little comes with the camera. You have the dial here for the different modes, the PSAM, the custom modes, and you have a couple other ones. I, of course, have it on the movie mode. The vlog mode is really interesting. So let me show you what's going on with the vlog mode. Now, if I turn this camera on here, this is the regular mode. And if I switch this to vlog mode, you'll see that there are a few different things on the screen here, and it's much more touch focused and more simplified, and there's some automatic modes and stuff like that in there. So if you're less comfortable shooting video and you're doing some vlogging, you do have that cool vlog mode in there. I didn't get to play with it too much because I pretty much only shoot in manual mode. Over here we have the on-off switch, which I think is in a great position, and it's very satisfying and works really well. The shutter button, the record button, an exposure control dial here, which works well, and then the Q button here for getting into the Q menu. Onto the back of the camera, we have no EVF. We also just have this flip screen, which does fully articulate for filming yourself and for different angles and stuff like that. You probably noticed these two screw holes and this place for a connector here. Fuji makes a fan that you can screw into the back of this if you want longer run times and keep the temperature down in the camera in higher temperature environments and stuff like that. So I have never actually used it before, but that's what that is there for. And the other things on the back here, we have a couple of buttons. We have the drive trash can button. This thing is kind of interesting. This is actually the mic jack. This is the 3.5mm mic jack. And I'll talk a little bit about why they put it up here. And I think it was an interesting design choice when we talk about the rest of the I/O. We have the playback button, the AE, AFL button, and then on the bottom right part, we have just a couple of controls. First of all, we have this joystick, and you can manipulate the focus point and the menus with this, and then you also can press it in to select. And I don't love this implementation. I think it's nice that it's very simplified and there's not much going on here, but I was constantly like pressing it and not getting the right response that I was expecting. So I could just be sort of taking some more time to get used to it, but there's no D-pad here, and I felt like this is a little bit awkward for me personally at times. Then the two buttons on the bottom here are very straightforward. You have the menu and then you have the display back button. So operating the menus between going in the menu and backing out was really simplified with these three buttons on the back of the camera, but that's basically it for the back. Now, talking about the I/O is interesting because on the left-hand side of the camera, we don't have any ports. And generally on mirrorless cameras, all of the ports are located on the left side of the camera. The problem here is because the camera is so small that if we had ports over here and the screen would just hit all of them. So what they did was basically, if you're going to be using this camera really stripped down like this, you're just gonna be using the camera like this, like for photography or something like that. Now, if you are plugging in stuff here to, run the camera for video stuff, the ports are actually on the right-hand side of the camera. So we have a few basic ports here. We have the micro HDMI, USB-C, which you can use for charging. And then you also have a headphone jack on this side. So again, very simplified port situation here, and that's the reason why I put the mic jack on the back here, just to keep it sort of out of the way, and again, keeping that left side clean. In terms of the strap eyelets here, they have these built-in ones, which are much better than the flappy ones you see on some of the other brands. They are a little bit sharp on your hands, although with larger mirrorless cameras, I will be gripping it more firmly, but this one is so small, it was more like a claw or a pinch situation holding it, so these didn't really bother me so much, but they are a little bit sharp. I wish they were kind of like the recessed kind like you see on some of the other cameras. In terms of the grip, it is really not very big here. So you probably either want to just deal with it and keep it really small, or get some sort of cage grip extension type thing, or maybe one of those thumb grips that goes on the back that slides into the hot shoe. So there are definitely options there. Now onto the bottom of the camera, there's a couple of interesting design choices here. We have the quarter 20 here for mounting tripod plates, and in here we have the battery, which is a smaller battery. one of Fuji's smaller batteries, and actually gets decent runtime. I'll talk about runtimes and overheating a little bit later. And then you have the one SD card slot that's inside of here. That's a single slot, and it's located in the battery compartment. Now, the issue I have with the bottom of the camera is that if you put any sort of tripod, normal tripod plate here, it actually blocks the door. So when you are looking to open the door to get the battery or the memory card out, you have to take the plate off. Now, there are some companies that make base plates or cages that sort of work around this and keep that door open, but if you're using a regular base plate, that is going to be an issue, so I just wanted to point that out. Now, onto the front of the camera, we do have one control dial here, so we only have two control dials for exposure. We have one on the top and one on the front. The one on the front, you can press it in, so I was using this to toggle between shutter speed and ISO, and had the top one at aperture. That's just my own personal preference. And that's it for the front. Now, getting onto the sensor here, we have a 26.1 megapixel APS-C, so 1.5 times crop, BSI CMOS sensor. Now, BSI is backside illuminated, if you don't know what that stands for, and it's generally better at getting cleaner images at higher ISOs or low light. So I believe this is the exact same sensor that is in the Fuji XS20, and the main differences between this and the XS20 is that the XS20 has an EVF, it has IBIS, this camera does not have IBIS, and it also has some extra codecs and stuff like that. So let's get into talking about codecs, resolutions, and frame rates. So I think one of the biggest features of this camera, like I mentioned earlier, is the fact that it shoots in 6.2K open gate, which is a ratio of 3:2. So if you're unfamiliar with open gate recording, basically when you have a hybrid camera or a photography camera, it usually has a sensor that has a ratio of 3:2. And when we're recording video, we're often recording in 16:9 or 17:9, and it's throwing away pixels on the top and the bottom of the sensor. But when you record an open gate, you are recording the entire sensor for video. Now, this is something that's becoming a little bit more common with some of the newer cameras, which is absolutely fantastic for a lot of different reasons. First of which is reframing. Because you're recording the entire height of the sensor, it's really great for reframing for vertical video because you're recording more vertical pixels. You can also reframe everything, and you can also punch in quite a bit, because if you're recording in 6.2K and delivering in 4K, you can zoom in without losing any quality. It is also really handy for anamorphic shooting, where you have higher squeeze factor lenses. When you have open gate recording and recording more vertical pixels, it really does help with that. It's also a different aspect ratio for creative purposes. And like I showed earlier on with the image quality examples, I shot that in the open gate, and it just looks really cool, and it's kind of fun to mix it up every once in a while. So back into the camera here, we have a lot of different modes. We also have the 4K 16:9 mode, which you can shoot in 24 up to 60 frames per second. Now, I do want to mention that if you are shooting in 60 frames per second, it does crop in 1.18x, and you can see that here, and I think it's really cool that it does show you that on the screen. In addition to the 4K 16:9, we also have 4K LP, which basically crops in on the sensor a little bit, and this is recording less resolution off the sensor, and it allows the camera to run longer and overheat less. I didn't experiment with this too much, but it is an option in there. And lastly, we have the 4K DCI, which is a 17:9 mode, and you can record that again up to 60 frames per second. Now let's look at the different codecs and bit rates in the camera. So coming down here to the media record settings, if we come over here, and you can see there's a few different options. We have H.264 and H.265. Now, the only 422 option in this camera is going to be the H.265 422 MOV. That's the one I'd recommend that you shoot with to give you the highest quality. And you can shoot that up to 200 megabits per second. In addition to the H.265 422, which is great to have 10-bit 422 internally, we can also shoot external RAW, which is a huge advantage for this camera. Now, I didn't get to try this out, but at the moment, I don't have a Blackmagic Video Assist, and I do have a Ninja V, but that only records in ProRes RAW, and I've been editing in DaVinci Resolve lately, so it would be something to test out in a future time period. But in terms of the external RAW, if we turn this on, we have a few different options, both for an Atomos recorder and a Blackmagic recorder. So you can shoot in 6.2K open gate or 5.2K 16:9. And like I said, you can shoot in either ProRes RAW or B-RAW with this. So lots of cool opportunities here for internal and external RAW recording, which for the price of $800 is really surprising. And there really aren't other cameras in that price point that do that with all these other features. So that's really cool. Next, let's talk about dynamic range, and at the same time, we'll test out the internal microphone of the XM5. This is the forward priority mode. Now, if you're unfamiliar with dynamic range of a camera, that's the camera's capabilities of capturing highlight and shadow information at the same time. So this right here is a great example to demonstrate the dynamic range. We have bright highlights, we have the sky and the grass, and I'm here in the shade on my front porch. So to capture the most dynamic range in a camera, you want to record in its log profile, and right now I'm recording in f-log2. This is what it looks like right out of camera, and this is what it looks like, what you've been looking at as after I've graded it. Now, there are a couple ways of testing dynamic range. The two ways I like to show on this channel, of course, are a scene with a lot of dynamic range like this by doing a more controlled setting where I film myself in a dark room next to a bright window. And then I also look at what's known as a latitude or push-pull test. Now, there's a lot of misconception about this. A lot of people think that this is how far you can over or underexpose the image. It really is to determine how the camera behaves in the extremes of its bright highlights and darkest shadows. And the way we do this is over and underexposing the camera, and then adjusting it in post. So let's go take a look at those tests. All right, so here's the first comparison. We have the XM5 on the left against Fuji's X-H2S on the right, which is their flagship APS-C camera, which costs 3 times as much as the XM5. In this test, I exposed for the highlights, the bright areas outside, and we'll take a look at the shadows and see what's going on here. Now, this is f-log2 on both cameras and completely ungraded. Now, looking outside, I think the highlights look very similar in terms of the roll-off and character, but there's definitely a difference in the shadows in terms of the color and the detail there. So this is after grading, and I just used some color space transforms in Resolved and lifted the shadows a little bit so we could sort of see what's going on here. Like I said, I think that the highlights look pretty similar between these two cameras. I don't see too much of a difference there, and that makes sense because we're shooting both of these in f-log2, so they should perform pretty similarly. But the shadows are definitely different. My shirt is a slightly different color, as you can see, and you could probably already see there's more noise on the XM5. Now, zooming in here, you can definitely see it a little bit more exaggerated, both in terms of the detail and the noise in the shadows. I would definitely say that the X-H2S does better in the shadows and therefore has more dynamic range, which is totally expected with a much more expensive camera. But I think that the XM5 does a pretty good job and has quite a bit of dynamic range, and in my opinion, more than I expected before I started testing this camera. Next is the latitude or push-pull test, like I was mentioning earlier, and I overexpose and underexpose the camera and then correct it in post. This, again, is not to show you how far you can over or underexpose the image, but really to show you how the image performs in the extreme highlights and shadows. At 4 stops over, they both look fine, as most mirrorless cameras do, and they break at 5 stops. Again, highlights look really similar, backing up to what we saw with the window test. Looking at the underexposure test here, they're looking pretty similar right off the bat. This is where we'll probably see some differences between the two cameras. At 2 stops under, you can start to see the XM5 getting a little bit noisier, and the X-H2S is, I think, a little bit cleaner. At 3 and 4 stops, you're starting to see even more noise and that CMOS smearing or that horizontal banding on the XM5. So the window test also backed up with the latitude test, similar in the highlights, a little bit more dynamic range in the shadows on the X-H2S, but a good, strong performance by the XM5. Next, take a look at the low light performance of the XM5 compared against the X-H2S. Now, these aren't considered to be low light specialists in any way, but I wanted to sort of see how it did and stacked up against the X-H2S. I think they both perform pretty similar. I think the XM5 is a little bit noisier, but what I really like here is that the chroma noise is really well controlled. And again, this is with all noise reduction turned off in camera. I'd say that the XM5 is just a little bit noisier. The noise is a little bit bigger and blockier. And one thing I've always really liked about the X-H2S is that really fine noise pattern. It looks pretty organic. But again, no real surprises here. I think they both do pretty well in the middle ISO range and get noisier as you go up. These are not dual base ISO cameras. Next, let's talk about autofocus. And I know that Fuji gets a lot of criticism for their autofocus. They have improved it quite a bit over the years with different firmware updates and new cameras. In my opinion, it's not as good as some of the competition, especially like Sony and Canon. It does work pretty well in well-lit situations. I did a quick test here. You can see the camera screen on the right versus the output on the left. This was using the face and eye detection mode on the camera. And like I said, it did pretty well. This is at f1.4 with the 18mm lens. It's not perfect, but I think in some situations it's definitely usable. Now, I did notice even when filming this scene here, you could see it pulsing quite a bit. I was fairly underexposed here because I was trying to point out, the dynamic range of the camera, and I was much darker than I probably should have been. But it's not a super reliable system as it could be with some other things. So this is a very modern lens from Fuji. These were the base settings in the camera. I didn't mess around with any of those settings. So like I said, I was shooting that with the face and eye detection mode turned on. Now there are a bunch of different subject detection modes, which I didn't really get to play with. We have animal, bird, automobile, motorcycle and bike, airplane and train. In my limited autofocus testing, I don't think this camera is as reliable, as I said, to some of the other competition like Sony and Canon. So I just want to show you my results that I got in my limited experience. Next, we'll talk about stabilization. And I did mention earlier that this camera does not have IBIS, or an in-body image stabilization, a physical sensor shift stabilizer, but it does have a digital stabilization system, and I wanted to show you how well that worked. This is a very lightweight camera on purpose. It's supposed to be small and lightweight, but one thing that's tricky about a very light camera without IBIS is that it picks up all the micro jitters. So when I was shooting the street video stuff, I had the digital stabilization turned on. I was kind of resting it on a sling bag that I had to try to stabilize it, and I did add some stabilization in post. So let's take a look at some of the different modes on this camera. So here is a quick vlog test. This is again with the 18 1.4. This is no stabilization, and I'm just walking along here, not being careful, just to give you a baseline of what it looks like. This is with the digital stabilization turned on, and you can see it sort of pulsing and bouncing. You can definitely see my footsteps, which you would totally expect with a digital stabilization. It does crop in a little bit. And here they are compared against each other just to give you a sense of a rough walking test. And you can see that the stabilization is a little bit smoother, but it does crop in a little bit more. I think the digital stabilization is better for static tests. So here's a static test. This is no stabilization. You can definitely see my micro jitters. And then here is with the digital stabilization turned on, it crops in a little bit, but definitely smooths it out quite a bit. And lastly, the boost mode is another option for you. Now keep in mind, this is with an 18mm lens. So if you're using a longer lens, of course, the jitters and the shakes will be a lot more prevalent, but you have the digital stabilization mode in there to play with. If you were looking for a more stable shot than that, I'd highly recommend that you put this on a gimbal or a tripod. I think this camera would work really well on a gimbal because it's so small and lightweight. You could probably use a very small gimbal, and I think it would work really well. You could also build this up with a video rig and put a big V-mount battery on there and a monitor and add a bunch of weight to try to get it a little bit more stable. So that could also be an option for you. But if you are looking for a really simplified handheld video, you're going to be a little bit more limited than you would be with a camera that has IBIS, for example, like I mentioned, the XS20. Next, we'll talk about the sensor readout speed and the rolling shutter performance. When you have a sensor that is slower to read out, you will get some rolling shutter artifacts. So you can definitely see this when the camera is panning or you have some fast moving subjects, you will see them start to skew or get wavy and warpy. So testing this out in the 6.2K open gate mode in 24 frames per second, I got 23.9 milliseconds, which is not a very strong performance. It's a fairly slow readout speed, and you will get a lot of rolling shutter artifacts. Now, reading it out in 4K UHD in 24 frames per second, I got 20.2 milliseconds, which is a little bit faster, which makes sense because it's throwing away the top and the bottom of the sensor, and it's reading out less off the sensor, but this is oversampled from the full width. And lastly, the 4K UHD in 60 frames per second, which has that 1.18 times crop, I got 15.8 milliseconds, which again makes sense because we are reading off a smaller part of the sensor. So overall, I would say rolling shutter is not great on this camera. It would be nice to have a faster readout speed, but it's definitely one of the drawbacks if you are shooting fast-moving subjects, or you're whipping the camera around, or you're moving in a vehicle or something like that. But if you're shooting mostly static stuff, interviews, things like that, you're probably not going to notice it, only if things are moving very quickly. Next, we'll talk about run times and overheating. Now, I did all my tests here in my studio, which is usually between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, it's early January here in North Carolina, and it's a little bit chilly outside. Otherwise, I would have definitely tested this outside in the sun and heat, which I like to do most of the year because it is pretty warm here a lot. So limited testing, right? Because I could only do this in my studio in a controlled environment. Now, I did two tests. The first one I did was the 4K UHD H.265 10-bit 422 mode, and I did this because I think that's the most common mode that people are going to record in. The camera ran for 1 hour and 37 minutes when the battery died. It didn't have an overheat warning, and the camera did not overheat. Now, this is impressive for two different reasons. First of which, an hour and 37 with that little battery is very impressive. There are some cameras that have bigger batteries that run for that amount of time or less, so great performance off that little battery. Also, the fact that it didn't overheat was really cool. Now, I did have the temperature setting set to high. I did have it on a tripod, and it had the screen open, which helps dissipate heat off the back of the camera. The camera was very warm towards the end of that runtime, but it didn't overheat. So that's really cool. So my next question was, could you use this for a studio setting, for interviews, for podcasting, long form recording? So I took it in the same mode and I plugged USB-C power delivery in and an HDMI connector to the monitor and plugged it into an external monitor. Now the camera ran for 4 hours and 8 minutes when it shut off, and I'm not sure what happened because it seemed like a random amount of time, but the screen didn't say that it overheated. So this is really impressive since the 4K is oversampled from that 6K full width of the sensor. There's no fan in this camera. I was pushing power in through USB-C, and a lot of cameras, when you're using HDMI out, also increases the heat of the camera. So in my limited testing here, this camera could definitely be used for long form in a studio setting in a controlled environment. This is very limited testing. I did 2 tests in a controlled environment. I would like to see how this does outside in the heat and not in a controlled environment, but pretty impressive for what I saw so far. So finally, let's get into talking about the competition and my conclusion and final thoughts. Now, I kind of think this camera is kind of in a league of its own. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it punches way above its weight. And that's because in terms of video quality, this one's hard to beat for the price point. It has great dynamic range. It could shoot in 6.2K open gate 10-bit 422 internally recorded in the camera. It also shoots in DCI, in UHD. It can shoot up to 60 frames per second, and also has external raw recording to an Atomos Ninja V or a Blackmagic Video Assist. I don't know many cameras in the price point that can do that, so that kind of puts it in a league of its own. But let's talk about some of the other cameras, because there are a few to talk about. First of which is the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. Now, I haven't tested that camera yet, and I hope to soon, but I have tested the A6700 and the FX30, which have the same sensor, and I've documented those on this channel here, so I'm fairly confident about my understanding of the sensor in that camera. That camera also is fairly small. It does not have IBIS or an EVF, but I think where this camera is going to beat it out is in terms of those video specs. The ZV-E10 Mark II does not have open gate recording, does not have external raw recording, and I haven't directly compared that, but I was really impressed, like I said, with the dynamic range of this camera. Next up would be the Nikon Z50 Mark II, which I haven't tested out yet, and I'd like to sometime soon as well. I don't know too much about that camera, but it doesn't, again, in terms of video specs, this camera is definitely going to outperform that. Next would be the Canon R7, or maybe even the R8, coming in just over $1,000. But again, for video specs and external raw recording, again, the XM5 is going to probably beat it out in a lot of ways. Those cameras are bigger and have an EVF and IBIS. Well, the R8 doesn't, but the R7 does. If you step down to like the R10 and the R50, those cameras don't even shoot in log. So, I don't think those are real competitors. And I think even in the Fuji system, you could probably even talk about this against the XS20, which is significantly more money, but you do, like I said, get the EVF, the IBIS, and more codecs like All Intra. So, like I said, I think this camera is kind of in a league of its own for image quality, and I think it's really impressive that Fuji was able to put this camera together for $800. If you're looking for a very small camera with really good image quality, that's got some quirks and limitations to it, I think this could be a great option for you, especially if you're in the Fuji system. I'm really impressed with the image coming out of this camera, and it would have been cool to test out the raw recording, which I didn't get a chance to, but overall, really cool little camera. Great job, Fuji. If you enjoyed this, make sure you hit subscribe. I really appreciate you watching, and we'll see you in the next one.